because the lines in my painting are starting to lead and create that illusion that there is a ridge there that these lines are traveling over. And that's the next step, is just getting these lines here, for example, and start just sort of like dragging them down and just sort of creating this illusion that there is, you know, shape and form to the object, that it's not just this flat shaded object, because there's a lot of detail and texture in this apple. We will get into detailing a little bit more in depth later, but just for now, once you've gotten to this stage with the blending, and all your colors are sort of starting to blend together and you've got your primaries and your secondaries together, what you need to do next is start really looking at like the form of the apple, the way that the lines in the apple flow, things like that. So for example, these pink lines. Okay, so we have a bit more detail in the apple now. As you can tell from the last one, I continued doing those pink lines and keeping that flow happening there, and I continued it around here. I started to sort of add the detail in the center here, added that little shadow, started painting the stem of the apple, added a little shadow and a ridge around here, and just generally started focusing a little bit more on detail. As you can see, these lines are starting to flow down here. The white highlights are a little bit messy now, and they also follow the contours of the apple. Really all I did for that was just make my brush smaller and then just sort of just brush very lightly up and down like this, up and down, and just followed the contours of the apple. It really is very important when you're painting something that has contours that you follow those contours while you're painting it. If, for example, a sphere, you really should follow the contours of that sphere. If you just go like left to right, you're not going to get the same illusion of flow that you'll get if you follow the contours in the image. So that's all I've done here. I've just added more detail, made my brush smaller, started like painting in those little details and getting that flow happening around the contours of the image. Now, what we want to do now is add some more detail, and there are ways to do this. Now, firstly, you can make this hyper realistic if you want to. You can go through and like paint every little detail and just get as detailed as you like, and that's fine, and that's just a matter of time and patience. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm not going to do that. So a quick way of doing that is using texture brushes. Now, so far I've just been using a simple round brush, and now I've pulled out a texture brush. I will include these brushes along with the Photoshop file in the link on the side, so be sure to check them out. So what we're going to do is we're going to load up this little texture brush, and we'll pick this white color. And just so that we make sure we don't make any mistakes, what we're going to do is we're going to make a new layer on top of our layer that we already have. And we'll just call this texture. And so what we'll do is we'll just start playing around with this texture brush and just sort of lightly pressing and adding, you know, a little bit more detail to the edges. And you can see already that it's just starting to break up the edges a little bit, starting to make it a little less smooth, starting to add a bit more detail. And yeah, texture brushes are really, really useful, and they save a lot of time. And you're starting to see now that those edges are starting to break up and become a little bit more textured and high detail without us going in and painting painstakingly every little detail. So texture brushes can really speed things up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep painting with these textures, and when I come back I'll finish it off by showing you the shadow and maybe how to put these little yellow dots in with another texture brush. Okay, so I've gone through and added a little texture with the texture brush, and you can see that things are starting to look a little bit more interesting. Over here it's a little bit more broken up, the lines aren't so smooth, and it's starting to look relatively nice. I mean, we've captured, I think, most of what the apple, you know, most of the features of the apple, these highlights, you know, the green in the center. I mean, it looks like an apple now. When we started out, it didn't. So what we're going to do now quickly is we're just going to add the shadow to the base of the image, the base of the apple, just to give it something so that it's grounded on something. Now what I've done here is I've created a layer called shadow underneath the main color layer, which we use to paint our apple on, and underneath the texture layer. That's so that when we paint, for example, if I just grab this brown to illustrate, when we paint, we're actually painting underneath the apple, and so we can get right on top of the apple and make sure that our shadow lines up. It's quite useful to use layers when painting, because, you know, if you do paint everything on one layer and you make a mistake, you can't go back and change it as easily as if you just deleted the layer. And in this case, we can paint underneath the apple and not worry so much about going over the top of it or just running around those edges with a fine detail brush or any of that. So essentially the shadow is the same process as every other process in the apple. It's just a matter of putting your colors down and blending them. So when I come back from doing that, I'll show you the final little detail of adding these little yellow spots, and then I think we'll be done. Okay, So what I've done now is I've added the shadow, and I also went around the outside of my apple and cleaned up my edges a little bit. So it's kind of looking like an apple now, but we want to add that finishing touch, and that's the little yellow dots that you see all over it. So what I've done is I've picked my color, and it's sort of just this orangey, sort of yellowy color, and I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call it dots. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a texture brush, which you'll be able to download, a different one this time. So I'm just going to lightly brush them in, and you'll start to see these little yellow dots sort of appearing on the apple. And I'll try and add more where they're more concentrated. So up the top here, and there's quite a few down here. And that'll probably do. Now, you might see that they're not really blending in with the image, and that's where Photoshop comes in handy, because we can just select this layer and choose the blending mode, and we can set it to say overlay. And now it starts to sort of blend into our image a little bit more. But really, you're going to want to have a bit more control than that. So we've got it set to overlay, but now we're going to get the eraser tool, and we're going to go back to set it back to our normal brush, and we're going to lower the opacity of the eraser tool to say 30. Now what this will allow us to do is just slightly just take out some of these dots down the bottom where they don't kind of work, and just sort of have a bit more control over where they show up and where they don't. If a couple of them aren't working quite well, you know, you can tone them down a bit and not worry. In the ones that are working well, you just leave them. So for example, in here, these sort of three here aren't really standing out very well, so I might just tone them down a bit with the eraser tool, and now they're starting to blend in. And you can just do this all over the image. Wherever you feel that it's not looking too great, you can just take these down. If any spilled into your shadow, you can get rid of them. And I'd say that's starting to look okay now. So you can also play with other things. You can play with levels. You could, you know, tweak this in Photoshop afterwards and do all kinds of photo imaging techniques and stuff. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I think that's a pretty good result. So I hope this helped everyone, and look forward to more tutorials. Thanks. Bye.